Thank you very much. That's a very kind introduction. And I have to tell you, I am very, very pleased to be here as part of a large group to pay tribute and honor to Mano. It's a very, very richly deserved award. I've really enjoyed serving on the board of the NED with him. And I'm just happy to be part of the entertainment for this celebration. Peter, thank you very much for that kind introduction. This is an interesting gathering this evening for essentially two purposes. In addition to our foreign policy and democracy promotion focus this evening, we also have something of a securities regulatory focus, and we'll divide it up sort of even Steven. I'll address my formal remarks to the topic of democracy promotion and the connection between that topic and capital markets, and then in an informal Q&A session afterward, you'll probably want to hear all about securities regulation, so we'll do a deep dive into that topic. I particularly, as I say, have enjoyed serving on the board. So as you know, I have two hats: chairman of the SEC and board member of the National Endowment for Democracy. And it's in the latter capacity that I'm speaking to you this evening. So you need to know that the views that I express will be my own and not those of the Securities and Exchange Commission. And you'll see why I have to say that in a moment. So speaking as a board member, let me take a moment to brag a little bit further on the National Endowment for Democracy and also on the FPA. Like all great things, the FPA and the NED began each with a vision and with a dream. And although our nation's founding fathers didn't envision these organizations, they embraced their purposes, and I think that they would approve of how you are fulfilling them. You're doing in the 21st century what Thomas Jefferson urged Thomas Paine to do in the 18th century. He said, "Go on doing with your pen what in other times has been done with the sword." Dante Fascell must have had this in mind when he set to work making the NED a reality. "The pen is mightier than the sword," he once said. "Ideas do climb walls, and they go under walls and over walls and through walls." Mr. Gorbachev undoubtedly would agree. The FPA and the NED's purposes complement and complete each other in ways that our founders would surely appreciate. The FPA's purpose is to explain the world to Americans, to inspire us to engage with it, and to help us to avoid the siren song of isolationism. And you do that with great resolve, with great honor, and great success. The NED completes the mission by enjoining us to act, to make the world a better place. The NED, simply put, is an American treasure, but it's also a global treasure. Each of us knows that it's an incomplete joy to experience liberty while we know that others do not. And so we don't jealously hoard the blessings of freedom. We eagerly help the champions of liberty in other lands, and we doggedly persist with the governments that oppose them. The NED's very existence reflects a uniquely American combination: the grand vision matched with a practical get-it-done attitude. It's born of the same boundless optimism and generosity of spirit that came together in the two men that founded it, Dante Fascell and Ronald Reagan, two men that it was my privilege to know and to work with. They both had a passion for liberty, and liberty not just for Americans, but liberty for people all over the world. They both understood that freedom and democracy are our nation's greatest natural resources and our most important exports. But as everyone in this room appreciates, it's not enough simply to encourage people's dreams. Millions of people across the globe can't pursue a dream of liberty because they have no access even to the information that could inspire such a dream. Of course, it would be nice if merely asserting the benefits of democracy would make the world beat a path to democracy's door. And it's perhaps with that convenient notion in mind that it's so often been stated in essentially syllogistic terms that economic liberalization will inexorably lead to political liberalization and eventually to democracy. Despite the fact that determinism is a singularly Marxist notion, this syllogism is frequently accepted by the most dogged opponents of totalitarianism. But an examination of the record makes it clear that if we're to successfully promote democracy, we'll have to do a lot more than just trade. It has been more than a quarter century since Deng Xiaoping opened up China's economy, and over 15 years since the collapse of Soviet communism. In the intervening period, China has experienced sustained economic growth without any visible movement towards democracy. And Russia's economy, having survived total collapse in the late 1990s, is now growing on the strength of high oil and gas prices at the same time that its democracy is diminishing. Exactly 10 years ago, in a personal meeting I had with Jiang Zemin in the Forbidden City, I asked him when his government would move beyond their vaunted village elections to the genuine election of a mayor and a city council in a significant municipality. His answer was at least 20 years. But because the interpreter took quite a while to pass on what was a very succinct statement, I've always thought that what he really said was, not in my lifetime. And if Jiang had in fact hazarded that prediction, events would have proved him entirely correct. And in fact, the trends since his death have all been in the wrong direction. In recent days, Premier Wen Jiabao announced to the world that China will not be a democracy for at least 100 more years. Meanwhile, in Russia, President Putin has eliminated elections of the nation's governors and converted the Duma into a compliant body as a result of elections that, according to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, quote, failed to meet many OSCE and Council of Europe commitments to democratic elections. If empirical results count for anything, this stubborn real-world data should by now have demolished the theory that economic growth and exposure to Western markets and ideas will of themselves, without more, yield pro-democratic change. In these two cases, at least, manifestly they have not. Indeed, the question is no longer, will economic liberalization lead to political liberalization, but rather, is rapid economic growth in these nations even compatible with democracy? I don't invert the conventional wisdom for emphasis or effect. Thanks to the effects of a relentless propaganda campaign waged through broadcast and print and state-controlled media, it's a commonplace in countries that lack media freedom that democracy and its trappings, such as a free press, actually pose a threat to economic growth. In both Russia and China, for example, public opinion polls reflect deep distrust of Western-style democracy. Many Russians associate the economic collapse of the 1990s with the perceived chaos of democracy, and so too the persistent social instability that was left in the wake of that collapse. The state-controlled media in China hammer on this theme as well. And the government propagandists are not without ammunition. For example, according to a recent study by the American Enterprise Institute that spans the time beginning with the collapse of the Soviet Empire until the present, countries that are economically free but politically repressed have consistently stronger economic growth. You heard me right. From 1991 to 2005, the average GDP growth in such countries has outpaced growth in countries that are both economically and politically free by over 3.6%. So tonight we might ask ourselves an unaccustomed question. Might it be possible that America's experience and that of other developed industrial democracies is anomalous? Might it be the case that far from being the necessary and healthy result of economic growth, democracy actually interferes with it? Rest assured that whether or not you're willing to ask that question, millions of people in other countries ask it themselves every day. And the fact that this is the way so many millions of people think poses a problem for groups such as the NED. Carl Gershman has to worry about this every day. Because when Americans talk about democracy, ordinary Russians and ordinary Chinese don't hear the voice of a caring fellow citizen of the world who wants only the best for them and their nation. They hear the voice of a competitor seeking to contain their nation and to inhibit its greatness. But just because democracy promotion is made more difficult when authoritarian systems can produce economic growth, doesn't mean that economic engagement with those countries is the wrong course. But it does mean that merely investing in authoritarian countries and then waiting for democracy somehow to materialize is not nearly enough. The United States must do more. As partners with other nations seeking to establish capital markets within their borders, we can help governments to discover that freedom in all of its manifestations, in particular the freedom to say and to write, to publish, broadcast, and think the truth as one understands it, without fear of persecution, is absolutely essential to a free capital market. And we can help them to appreciate the role that healthy and truly free capital markets play in job creation, resource allocation, and national economic growth, all of which are manifestly in each of these countries' self-interests. Neither China's nor Russia's capital market is mature or capable presently of producing anything like the level of investment that their countries currently require, or that perforce they will require as they continue to grow. The same is true of almost every country in the world whose political system is less free than its economy. For the domestic capital markets in those countries to succeed, they will sooner or later have to focus on the basic ingredients of a free market. And the first among these essential ingredients is that buyers and sellers of securities need information in order to trade. The better the information, the more efficient the market. Public disclosure of all material information is absolutely essential to an efficient market. It's what separates investing from roulette. And if a nation's government restricts the flow of information about publicly owned companies, it will relegate its domestic capital market to mere speculation. This is a particularly acute point when the companies whose securities are being traded are owned or controlled by the government. If all that investors can buy is a minority share in a government-controlled enterprise, and if critical information about the controlling shareholder and ultimate parent is restricted by that very government, a key component of a genuine market will be missing. Not only that, but a key component of investor protection will be missing as well. That's why China's and Russia's restrictions on the media and similar censorship in other nations seeking to develop their capital markets are of direct concern to investors. Controls on news and information, including information about the very government that controls the countries in which investors are being asked to put their money, obstruct the transparency that investors in efficient markets demand. Another ingredient of a genuinely free market is marketplace actors who make decisions based on economic motives of profit and loss. This assures that the market will perform its most critical function, allocating resources efficiently across the economy. But governments act for reasons of national interest, which, while important, can be very different. So by vindicating political and strategic concerns instead of purely economic motives, government-owned companies can distort the proper functioning of markets. Shareholders will naturally wonder whether actions are being taken because of an economic rationale or because of political calculations. Conversely, if a company is majority owned by shareholders and not by the government, then the normal workings of shareholder democracy will ensure that the business is run in their economic interest. This is a powerful check against corporate management becoming complacent, or much worse, corrupt. Private shareholders insisting on their economic rights is the best way to establish corporate accountability and efficiency. When shareholders seek to promote market reforms and to improve efficiency and corporate accountability, their efforts must be respected, not thwarted. And that has to be true whether or not those owners have minority interests or controlling stakes. The third ingredient is tough, independent regulation. It's what we do at the Securities and Exchange Commission, and it's absolutely essential to maintenance of investor confidence. Here again, the issue of state-owned versus privately owned companies is of central importance. For regulation to be truly effective, it has to be arm's length. It must be independent. If the regulator and the regulated are one and the same, there is an inherent conflict of interest. Tough, independent regulation in the United States or in any country is the bedrock of investor protection and the sine qua non of an efficient capital market. The prevalence of state-owned companies in the capital market also bears directly on the quality of information about issuers that investors can receive. That's because private companies, unlike national governments, can be forced by regulators to disclose information to shareholders. This is not necessarily true, it goes without saying, of state-owned companies. As a result, investors in state-controlled companies are reasonably concerned that they may lack the necessary material information to make informed decisions. In the cases of China and Russia, where large state-controlled or state-affiliated companies are selling only minority stakes to public investors, progress in transforming these firms into genuinely private enterprises will be key to determining whether adequate investment information and truly efficient markets can ever exist. Beyond all of this, sturdy legal remedies to enforce investors' rights are the next key ingredient. The reason that this is so important is that it goes to the core of investor confidence, which in turn is the essential underpinning of a healthy capital market. Clear and readily enforceable legal redress against fraud by the issuer or by other market participants ensures that the rights of every individual are protected. Every shareholder has to know that his or her economic interests will be protected both by corporate management and by the legal system. This is without a doubt the most important role that the government has to play in ensuring free and efficient markets. A share in a company, after all, is a property right, and it must be enforceable in law. So not only honest, independent courts, but also a tough, independent regulator are absolutely essential to investor confidence. The role for government is to be tough, independent, and neutral, not to be player and referee at once. The Securities and Exchange Commission is committed to assisting our counterpart regulators in other nations to build strong, free, fair, and open markets. For several years, we've trained both Russian and Chinese securities regulators here in America and in their home countries in subjects ranging from anti-money laundering to the detection of insider trading to the prevention of market manipulation. And there's much more to do. As Russian and Chinese companies prepare to issue securities to American investors and to investors in markets around the world, we will redouble our efforts to promote shareholder democracy, access to material information, and tough, independent regulation. And as we work with regulators from other countries in helping them understand the mechanics of market regulation, the overarching lesson is always this: freedom can't be compartmentalized. Without freedom of information, freedom of speech and thought, and the rule of law to defend them, there can be no real economic freedom, and certainly no truly efficient and free markets. The blessings of freedom are available to all who seek them, and they include not only the spiritual and the intangible, but very real economic blessings as well. To those of you here this evening who are associated with the FPA and the NED. And to all of you who support the work of these organizations, I want to thank you for what you do. I want to thank you for your work and your support for promoting freedom and democracy and understanding among nations. Like Ronald Reagan and Dante Fascell, you're men and women of vision and of dreams. You probably remember when President Reagan bade farewell to public life, he shared with the nation his vision for the future. And that vision is just as appropriate to the work of the NED and FPA. His words 15 years ago seem especially fitting as we approach St. Patrick's Day because they sound very much like an Irish blessing. My dream, President Reagan said, is that you will travel the road ahead with liberty's lamp guiding your steps and opportunity's arm steadying your way. Through your work, you're helping to create a world in which millions of others can find the strength, the knowledge, and the resources to discover their own dreams of freedom and democracy for themselves and for their children. So may the road rise up to meet you in your work, and may the winds of democracy always be at your back. Thanks very much.
Good evening. I have the pleasure at this time to introduce Bob Moritz. Bob heads the Assurances Services practice at PricewaterhouseCoopers and is going to be the moderator tonight for our further discussion with Chairman Cox. Before going further, I just want to thank Chairman Cox for those very interesting remarks. As well as for being polite enough, he was a year ahead of me in law school, as well as for being polite enough not to have reminded me that I was the worst, least accurate site checker in the history of the law review that he and I were on together more than a few years ago. Returning to Bob, throughout his more than 25 years with PwC, Bob has served in numerous leadership roles across the firm, including as managing partner of the New York office and Metro region, head of the financial services audit and business advisory practice, and the audit partner and global client service partner for JP Morgan Chase. Bob's work and responsibilities have spanned the globe, and he has wide-ranging expertise on audits for commercial and investment banks and various other financial service clients around the world. He also spent 3 years in Tokyo, where he provided audit and advisory services to numerous U.S. and European financial institutions. Indeed, he is deservedly recognized as one of the foremost practitioners in his field. Now, many of you may already know this much about Bob. What most of you probably don't know is that Bob is also an avid motorcyclist, a practitioner of the martial art of Taekwondo, and an enthusiastic drummer. As I myself am the managing partner of Davis Polk, a large law firm, I can easily understand the drum thing. Bob manages a $4 billion business with 1,000 partners, and the urge to pound back at something may at times just be overwhelming. The motorcycle and the Taekwondo thing gave me an initial pause, however. These are pastimes one usually associates with Evel Knievel and Bruce Lee, rather than sort of careful and quiet accounting and financial analysis. These hobbies seemed a little exciting, shall we say. So I turned to the internet and I found on the Lloyd's of London insurance website a list entitled Hazardous Activities. I scanned down that list past such treacherous-sounding entries as base jumping, dragon boat racing, and luge, and I learned that, in fact, motorcycling was nowhere to be found. Not surprising that Bob had already fully assessed and managed the risks of his chosen hobby. But further down the list, I did find martial arts. In fact, it's quite near mountain climbing requiring the use of ropes. So, nevertheless, you have to see everything in context. Bob is, after all, the man with ultimate responsibility for more than 2,000 audit reports, so perhaps biking down the highway and practicing martial arts are not really so exciting by comparison. In any event, those 2,000 audit reports are in the safest and surest hands around, even if those hands are sometimes on the handlebars of a Harley or are registered as dangerous weapons. So please join me in welcoming Bob Moritz.
I now have 3 things to do when I leave here. First and foremost, it sounds like I need to talk to my secretary around giving out my bio, because clearly there could have been a better draft than the one John got. Second is we're here tonight to talk a little bit about democracy and the interpins between democracy and capital markets. And I think for many of us here in the United States, we think about that as equating to the almighty dollar. And when you think about the almighty dollar, I do need to pay John for the kind words, very much so, and the kind introduction. The third thing to do is get me off the stage and, quite honestly, talk to the chairman. And as luck has it, we have had an interesting series of events over the last couple of weeks, culminating with yesterday and today, around what he has been doing, along with many others, around the issues associated with the capital markets. And I thought we would do this evening is spend some time with a little bit of facilitated Q&A between he and myself, and open it up to the audience for some questions. So I ask you to think about any things that may be on your mind that we might not touch here in the Q&A, and in a couple of minutes we'll open up for your suggestions on topics. So again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome aboard. Let me start with an easy one. Many of you in the audience don't realize this, but actually the chairman's roots and the intersection between democracy and capital markets goes back a long way. Most probably don't understand that he, I believe with your father, started back in the 80s a small business that actually translated the leading newspaper in the Soviet Union into English. And that in fact was then provided to countries around the world to understand exactly what was being said. So with that in mind, let me start a little bit in bridging the gap between some of the things you spoke about in the capital markets. One, what was that experience like? And secondarily, how has that influenced some of the thinking of what you want to accomplish in the role that you've got today?
Well, I had a lot of fun in that very unusual business. The substance of it was, as you point out, very unique. Literally, we reproduced. How many people here ever saw Pravda or heard of it? Surely some people have heard of it. The New York Times of the Soviet Union was all of 6 pages long, but without ads. It was very different in almost every respect from a normal newspaper. There was a real art to reading it because things appeared in the same place almost every day. And if there was a slight change, a little difference, you could infer from what was missing or from what was moved or changed perhaps a good deal about what the Communist Party was doing. And of course, under the masthead, it said the official organ of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So literally this was the party line, and it was the way it was communicated across the entire empire. So that part of it, and dealing with our markets, which were chiefly universities in 26 countries around the world, was a lot of fun. On the investing side, it wasn't. It consumed all of my money, and I had the experience of finding out what happens when you put your whole heart and soul in as an entrepreneur to something, and it disappears. There's a bit of a public market tale to this too that brought it all to a conclusion. Shortly before I went to work for President Reagan in the White House, we actually were getting ready to sell stock in a public offering, and that all was supposed to come to market in about December of 1987. But something happened in October.
Timing is everything.
And in all my years of practicing as a securities lawyer, I'd never seen people use the market out clause in an underwriting agreement, but they did this time. And I got kicked over into the next year and converted from a firm commitment to best efforts. And since I was completely unable to spend any time with it after that, we actually just rolled it up and kissed off the investment. And what a fortunate thing that was. I'm absolutely certain that I wouldn't be sitting here today as the Securities and Exchange Commission chairman if I had acquired a whole bunch of public investors in a one-product company right before the collapse of the Soviet Empire. I'm sure that the investors would have determined that I knew all along that the Soviet Union was going to collapse and that I should never have gotten them into that investment. But of course that didn't happen, and that's why I'm here.
Right, great. Well, let's jump into some of the comments you talked about earlier today. And one of the famous lines that many of us are familiar with is that pen being mightier than the sword at times. Some have argued that regulation, Sarbanes-Oxley in particular, exemplifies it just that what was written actually drove an environment that became so over-focused on regulation it did in fact impact the capital markets here in the States and the global competitiveness associated with it. Others argue that it was actually the way it was interpreted, how people chose to actually implement the rules and regulation as opposed to what was written. What's your perspective, being there at the time, as well as you sit here today as the head of the SEC?
Well, Sarbanes-Oxley is one of several legislative enactments that I have the opportunity to be on both sides of, both sides of the transaction, in Congress writing it and at the SEC interpreting the law and writing the regulations. It is true for Sarbanes-Oxley. It's true for Gramm-Leach-Bliley. We just finally wrote regulations with the Fed. Everybody here does not know about Gramm-Leach-Bliley. About half the room, I would guess, does. But this is essentially the repeal of the wall between investment banking and commercial banking and functional regulation in its place. But that was 1999 that I was on the House Senate Conference Committee for that piece of legislation. And we've just now proposed the regulations, and they should go into final form this year. And several other examples as well. So SOX, I'm quite familiar with. I know how we got to where we are. And of course, the provision of SOX that bothers people the most is Section 404. It's two seemingly inoffensive paragraphs. Nobody in the House or the Senate expected that this would cause all of the hell that's broken loose. But that's, of course, what's happened. The reason no one expected it is that the language was not brand new. It was borrowed from an existing federal law, FIREA, or pardon me, from FDICIA, the FDIC Improvement Act, almost word for word, and it had not caused all these problems in the banking industry. So there was every expectation that it was a tested approach and that it would work here. At the same time, however, Congress created something called the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, and that new organization, the PCOB, wrote an auditing standard to implement it that was several hundred pages long. And it was, as we now know, quite burdensome and prolix in the execution, with the result being that investors were paying far more, at least as best we can tell empirically, than they should have for the benefits that the law was intended to provide them. We're now setting about to fix that. The auditing standard will be repealed and replaced with something that's shorter, clearer, and focused on a top-down approach, an approach that is looking at what's really going to affect the financial statements, what's going to be material to them. We're going to try and have an instinct for the jugular rather than an instinct for the capillary.
When you sit here today, Mr. Chairman, do you think that the standard as proposed right now, the requirements from the SEC to management as well as the new promulgated rules relevant to the auditing profession, does it help solve the problem? Does it go far enough in your mind, relevant to some of the proposals that are on the table today?
Well, we certainly intended to do so. We're not finished yet.
Right.
There is a proposed standard now being exposed. The comment period has just ended. We're going to work with the PCOB. The process is that the PCOB adopts the rule, then it comes over to the SEC and we have to adopt it. But you can't amend it. So it's a little bit, or if you can, it is so cumbersome you'd rather not. It would take too long. It would take perhaps a year or more. So we need to get it right coming out of the PCOB. We may well have an open meeting at the Securities and Exchange Commission devoted to this before we're finished. Then it will come over to us, and hopefully this summer will be concluded with the rule part of it. It then will be necessary for us, that is with the auditing standard part of it, for us to implement it in a way that is consistent with the purpose. So the PCOB's inspections, the SEC's inspections of the PCOB inspections, all will be focused on efficiency as well as efficacy.
Well, obviously yesterday, as many have read in the paper, you spent a lot of time with a distinguished panel hosted by the Treasury Group that spent a lot of time focusing around what I'll call the commercial aspects of what's going on in the United States, the litigation and regulation issues that are out there today, and then obviously a bunch of other issues that have similar impact. Share with us a little bit your perspective of how that day went and maybe what surprised you as you sat there and listening to some of the feedback you were getting.
Well, it was a lot of fun, first of all. Any panel that has Warren Buffett on it is going to be entertaining, and it was. We had an audience that was a little bit more mixed even than this one, because we conducted this at Georgetown University. So we had a lot of mavens of finance, and then we had a bunch of students all mixed together. And the students were especially entertained when Warren Buffett described the passion that he has for reading financial statements as being just the same as a teenage boy reading Playboy.
I'm not sure I want to touch that any further, but why don't you continue?
We had two panels, and they were both comprised of very esteemed and knowledgeable individuals. The first panel was comprised of people in the markets, and the second panel was essentially former regulators with a public policy view on what to do about all the concerns raised in the first panel. In the second panel, Paul Volcker and Alan Greenspan were sitting next to each other, and they got into it a little bit. And just down, Bob Rubin, I was moderating along with Hank, so we were sitting on opposite ends of this lineup on stage. And Bob Rubin was sitting next to me, and next to him was Arthur Levitt, one of my predecessors, and they got into it a little bit. So it was fun. It was nice to be the moderator because I could be moderate, and they were all required to carry on, and they did a very good job of it.
Anything surprised you based upon the feedback you got?
You know, I think that we got a good sense of the different perspectives that people bring to this. There's some straw men in this debate. I mean, one of the straw men is that there's a real drive for lower standards or no standards. At least from that group, I didn't hear that. Certainly people want to change a lot of things and maybe go a lot further than we at the SEC will want to do. But I don't think there's a market anywhere among responsible people for dumbing down the standards. And certainly as chairman, I haven't any interest in that. What we're really talking about is how to sharpen our competitive edge in a world that is much more competitive now than anything that the United States has ever faced. We still have the world's largest capital market, and by a fair amount. And we should be very proud of that fact, and it's a result of our continued competitive advantages vis-a-vis others. But there are now some 50 exchanges around the world with a market capitalization of over $46 trillion. For the United States to own nearly 40% share of that market is really quite impressive. And Europe comes in at 27%, Asia and the Pacific 28%. So we have a lot still to be proud of. We're still the market leaders, but we cannot sit on our laurels. The opportunities that issuers now have to list in other markets is manifest. There are competitive considerations that formerly didn't exist. Regulators have to be part of this, and regulators need to be part of this not just to protect the economic opportunities in the United States, because we're not really set up that way. That's not the SEC's mission. What we really need to do is give U.S. investors the opportunity to have access to all these investing opportunities and to have access to these products in our markets within a framework of high standards and enforceable legal rights. Now, that's what we're aiming for. But we've got to keep up with the changes in the markets, including changes in technology, and work with our fellow regulators around the world if we're going to make that happen. By sharpening our competitive edge, I think that we can do better. But I'm going to do this, and I think everybody at the SEC is committed to doing this within a regimen of high standards, not dumbing down the standards.
I think just to follow up on that, there was reported that GE's CEO, Jeff Immelt, actually made the comment that what he was not arguing for was less regulation. What he was arguing for was actually more balance and judgment in applying those regulations. And I guess as you sit here today, one, is that a statement you subscribe to? And second is, how do we actually make that happen? How do we actually take the steps necessary to get there?
Well, I'm quick to observe that if I were not to subscribe to that statement, I would be standing up for imbalance and lack of judgment. So I find that easy to agree with. But how to bring it about, of course, is the key, because one person's good judgment is another person's lack of it. Balance is all in the eye of the beholder as well. These are subjective assessments. We are working with our international counterparts to try and have a global understanding, at least among high standards countries, of how best to do business as government regulators. I think that's a worthwhile undertaking. There's a lot of cross-border trade that's going on. It's going to increase. As a retail investor now, you can call up at least one online broker and buy foreign securities in a number of countries. That's obviously going to continue apace. So if our mission is protecting U.S. investors, we have to ask ourselves, protecting them from what and how, and we have to be very cognizant of these changes that are taking place. So I think that by coordinating with our counterparts, and I have spent an enormous amount of time with the FSA in London, with the Euronext College of Regulators, with regulators in Japan and China, other markets, we're talking together to make sure that none of us has to go it alone.
When you step back and pull together not only the last year and a half or so of your experience at the SEC, coupled with some of the comments that were discussed yesterday, if you had to prioritize your agenda, your personal agenda, in the seat you sit in, what are the top 3 priority points in terms of what you're trying to shape and ultimately accomplish?
Well, I start with the fact that first and foremost the SEC is a law enforcement agency. We have a strong program of enforcement. We're going to maintain it. No matter what happens technologically in the world, no matter what happens with cross-border integration, the fundamental problem of corporate finance and public company finance is going to remain. It's been with us since the South Sea bubble through Enron. It's going to be with us into the future. And that is when agents have control over other people's money, somebody's going to be tempted. And so there's got to be a cop on the beat. There's got to be a policeman in the SEC. Number one is that. The second thing that we're going to do, we have 2 things that we can do with our regulations. So in the second category fall both of those. First, we can make our regulations less expensive, and second, we can make the outcomes more worth owning, so you'd be willing to pay more for them. We can improve the quality. One of the ways that we can reduce the cost of regulation and improve the quality simultaneously is to take advantage of technology by making it easier for issuers to automate their filings with the SEC, and by making it easier for users to get information in a format that I call interactive data, so they can squeeze a lot more out of the information that's already there. We can accomplish both of those objectives. We can make it cheaper and better.
Well, obviously you're talking through around the use of technology today, and you speak of things like XBRL and the like. When you've traveled around the world, clearly I would say that most of our overseas counterparts are probably leveraging that more today than perhaps here in the States. How are you actually going to help try to make it happen here and leverage it to the extent possible to reduce the costs?
Well, one of the things that I have a great deal of confidence in is the marketplace figuring out how to use technology. They don't need the government for that. But what the marketplace can't do is file their information with the SEC in a way that takes advantage of that technology unless we let them. So this is really a question of us getting out of the way. We've got to enable this. The computer language for financial information that is making all of this possible is a private sector creation, and it is an international creation. It goes by the name of XBRL, which stands for Extensible Business Reporting Language, and I bet there are a few people in this room that know what XML stands for, Extensible Markup Language. It's a cousin of that. Some of you may know what all of you probably know what HTML is, but if you don't, you use it every day when you go on the internet. You're not supposed to know about it, you don't need to know about it, it's just the computer code that all this stuff is written in. Well, XBRL, if we use this to tag information that's filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission, the way it's being used right now to tag tax information that's being filed with Her Majesty's Customs and Revenue in the United Kingdom, will permit people to deal with the information outside of the forms in which it's provided. The SEC is a 1930s creation. When Joe Kennedy, the first chairman, set about figuring out how people were going to provide their information, they designed forms. And so today, in the 21st century, even though we have an electronic filing system called Edgar, all the stuff that's in there is really an electronic representation of a piece of paper. And all the data that's on that piece of paper is a prisoner of the four corners of the piece of paper it sits on. We want to liberate it from that so that, to put this in practical terms, if you've got a Microsoft product running on your desktop and it's got Excel in it, in the future, I imagine that Excel is going to support XBRL, so you just download stuff from, in fact, you won't download it, it'll come straight to your computer. It'll be an what's today is called an RSS feed, or in the future be called something else, but it's just going to come like radio waves onto your computer without any effort on your part, and populate a spreadsheet, and all the numbers are going to go where they belong. The ratio analysis you want can be all baked in there, whatever you want to do with it, or more likely, whatever your financial intermediaries want to do with it, so they can spit it out in a very easy to digest retail format. All that's going to be made possible. None of it's possible today, so questions like insufficient analyst coverage for certain companies, that's all a function of labor and cost. If an analyst can cover more companies because it's now possible to do so, that's good. We're trying to get more research coverage. A lot of issues in our capital markets are all centered around productivity and efficiency, and in this way technology can help.
Right. Well, a number of people were coming up to me during the cocktail hour interested in asking questions, so why don't we open it up, and I think we've got some microphones in the back of the room. For those that have questions, you can just raise your hand and we'll open it up for some dialogue. Sounds like we've got one over here.
Mr. Chairman, I think most of us in the private sector greatly applaud your efforts and Secretary Paulson's efforts on international competitiveness, but I wanted to come back to your earlier remark that many non-democratic regimes are doing better economically than democratic ones, and raise the question of whether, if they had good democratic regimes, they would have done even much better again. Thinking of Russia and China and the oil resources in Russia, if they had a true thriving democratic society and a rule of law, would they have even had better economic results? Or in the case of China, with their mercantile tradition, would they have done better without the pervading influence of the Communist Party in their state-owned banks and other enterprises?
Well, I certainly wouldn't defend the proposition that repressive state approach to human rights and political rights yields higher economic returns. Nor would I gainsay the possibility that if one has a liberal political system that respects human rights and freedom of speech and freedom of information and so on, that markets are going to function better. In fact, I would very comfortably be able to say that on the subject of capital markets, what I addressed this evening, without question, if there is freedom of information, the market's going to perform better. If there's rule of law, and it's honest and not corrupt, investors are going to feel more comfortable in that market if there's independent regulation. investors are going to feel more comfortable. If there are shareholder rights and genuine economic actors in that market, the market's going to be more efficient. And as a result, the lack of those things probably bespeaks a significant opportunity cost in the countries that are described as economically free but politically repressed, because they are not as economically free as they could be.
Other questions? Let me start here. Go ahead. Actually, go ahead. You can.
Yes, I'm curious, looking out for American investors, and given the lack of transparency in totalitarian governments like China and Russia, what sort of confidence do you have that the financial information American investors are getting when they buy Chinese companies or Russian companies is up to the same standard that they get here?
Well, if I may, since I've already spoken specifically about those two countries, let me speak generically about countries with lower standards than the United States, and not speak about those two countries and answer your question, if I may. By definition, if you're purchasing a security, which, as I mentioned, is a piece of paper only as good as the legal regime that surrounds it and the information that informs your judgment about purchasing it and continuing to hold it, and you don't have good information, and you don't have good redress, you don't have a good independent regulator to help you out, then you're gambling. And now a lot of people make a lot of money gambling if they are fortunate. A lot of people lose money in that same way, and I think the odds are more people end up on the losing than the winning side. But if you're just interested in the return and you don't care how you get it, then as long as that market's moving up and you're a gambler, then you can make hay while that sun shines. We have some of that Wild West in our own country in the micro cap market, and these extremely thinly traded securities that are promoted by faxes and emails. So you don't need to go abroad to do it. You can do it right here in America. Or you can just go to Las Vegas. They give you free drinks.
Just to follow up, if I can, Mr. Chairman, on that point.
Take it one step further. If I want to buy shares in a company traded in an exchange in Europe or an exchange in China or an exchange in India, I know I'm gambling, or I know I don't have the same information. What is the SEC's interest in my decision to do that?
Congress, in setting up the SEC, began with the simple premise that in order for the country to have a well-functioning capital market, that market itself should have integrity. And now that's just choice. You don't need to do it that way. Now we're seeing in other countries the idea of tiered markets and so on. There are many approaches to this, but in our system, which is a statutory system that I don't get to change, I implement it, we have a national market system that is supposed to have high integrity. So that's premise number one. Premise number two is that this is a repository of national savings and is so closely related to things that from a public policy standpoint we care about, such as people saving for their old age and their retirement, their health care and emergency needs, education, and so on, that we're not willing to risk it. We want integrity for that reason as well. And so the standards that are built in are meant to achieve that objective. That's the, I think, congressional public policy interest.
I understand that, and that clearly governs U.S. issued securities.
Right.
But foreign issued securities that I'm willing to take on the risk of not having those safeguards. What does the SEC have to say about that decision?
Well, at present, not much. I mean, right now, and I shouldn't say the SEC doesn't have much to say about it, but starting with the day I got there, the system that I inherited was not particularly addressed to that point, so that as long as you used a U.S. broker who worked through a foreign broker, you could buy something in another country. And if you own a mutual fund of international stocks, and you look through the list of things that it owns, undoubtedly you own stocks in all sorts of exciting regimes. So it is possible for U.S. investors, retail investors, rather easily to have, at least as part of a diversified portfolio, a whole lot of things. And the SEC hadn't tried to stop that. There's a related issue about hedge funds that I might as well bring up before somebody else does, because very widely misunderstood is the basis on which the SEC is proposing to adjust the current $1 million net worth requirement for retail investment in hedge funds. There really is no reason in current law or regulation, or in proposed future law or regulation, that retail investors can't buy hedge funds. Your Aunt Minnie with her last $10 can't buy the riskiest hedge fund that we know of, provided that that hedge fund discloses information to her, like any other security that's sold in public market. When you buy stock on the New York Stock Exchange or anywhere else, if it's publicly traded security, there's got to be a prospectus behind that. There's got to be certain disclosures made. And all we're talking about in this hedge fund area is people who want to be exempt from those disclosure requirements. And then the reason that it matters whether you're dealing with an investor that has a significant amount of investable assets is that we want to make sure that in that private transaction, the information that isn't being voluntarily provided by the hedge fund can be demanded by the purchaser as a matter of market power.
Just to follow up on the question, when we talk about the themes of the SEC influence in terms of what's going on overseas, one of the things obviously that many of the business leaders in the room today here are focused on is, are they at a competitive disadvantage when you think about some of the standards for some of that disclosure and requirements that are out there? And I know you've spent some time recently thinking through what I'll call the global standardization issue. How does one compare U.S. GAAP and reporting requirements and other things within the Securities Act to the international accounting standards and disclosure standards? What's your perspective of whether we can get convergence, and if so, how so?
Well, we're on a roadmap right now to convergence. We're following it. We are supportive of it. Our international counterparts are likewise supportive of it. And the destination, the estimated time of arrival is 2009. We're committed to that. We want to eliminate any requirement of reconciliation in the United States to international financial reporting standards, so that what presently foreign issuers have to do, which is report, number one, under IFRS, and then number two, reconcile it, do a whole second set of books, as it were, to U.S. GAAP, will go away. When that happens, which is very soon, if we stick with the roadmap, then the question naturally arises, if foreigners get a choice, what about domestic issuers? And really the debate seems to be, we just had a roundtable on this at the SEC, between choice on the one hand, or just a mandate that the SEC puts into effect, as Europe did, and it went into effect in 2005. You have a deadline and you say, by this date everybody reports in IFRS. Now that's a very, very different place from where we are today, because U.S. GAAP is not only very important in the United States, but all around the world because of the big footprint that we and our issuers make. So the convergence project that's underway between the FASB and the IASB is of enormous importance. That's a predicate that also needs to be executed and fulfilled before 2009. We don't need an identity between the two systems, but we want this process to be robust and continuing. And we also want to make sure that in, for example, all the European countries, 27 of them that are using IFRS, that there's not a separate implementation in each country, but that there's one system. We can converge with one system. We can't converge with a lot of different ones.
Great. So a question up here in the front. Go ahead. No.
Mr. Chairman, your perspective on executive compensation, does Chuck Prince deserve his $26 million?
What do you think? Executive compensation is of enormous interest to the Securities and Exchange Commission because it's of enormous interest to investors. And for that reason, we have, as you know, massively overhauled the executive compensation disclosure that's required of public companies. So if you're an investor or if you're an issuer, 2007 is going to be a big year. You're going to be disclosing if you're an issuer or receiving if you're an investor, or both, if you're on both sides and wear two hats. A whole lot more information about not only how much the boss is paid, but how that number is arrived at, so that if you want to know whether the boss, whoever it is, whichever company it is, deserves what he or she is getting, you'll have a lot more insight into that and a better way to answer it than subjectivity or gut feel. The compensation discussion and analysis that's now a baked-in part of the disclosure is supposed to be in plain English. Now, I'm going to be out hectoring on this subject because I happen to know that these disclosures are actually written by lawyers, and lawyers are bilingual. They speak English and they speak legalese. So we want to make sure that they use their native language when they do this. So
Which is that exactly?
You mentioned rule of law and focused on enforcement and the cop on the beat aspect. But one aspect of the rule of law is the current litigation system that we have, which there are those who would say is a real impediment to American competitiveness and is running out of control. Those people include me. I guess my question is, what do you think should be done about the current litigation system, if anything, and what do you think the prospects are for something being done?
Well, of course, in the position I now hold, my focus is on not the whole civil litigation system, but rather the securities portion of it. And in that space, I'm very comfortable saying that there is an important role to be played by private litigation as an adjunct to our official enforcement. But the private litigation has to be actually in furtherance of the public policy, the statutory objectives of the rules and policies of the Securities and Exchange Commission. If it is not, then it's doubly injurious to investors because it is expensive. The investors pay for this. When a company is sued and it's using the company's resources, those are the investors' funds. So if the lawsuit is not really in pursuit of sound public policy objectives, there needs to be oversight and discipline exerted with respect to it. That's the job, obviously, of the courts. Courts have to supervise these things, but it should also be the job of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Lawyers enjoy a monopoly privilege. They and only they can go before a judge in a court and represent other people who aren't licensed to do so. They are officers of the court and they have a sworn duty to uphold the truth. So this shouldn't be all about privateering. It should be all about justice. And to the extent that there are conflicts of interest built into certain representations where there is a financial stake in the outcome, and that financial stake might run into the hundreds of millions or even exceed $1 billion, is now occasionally the case, it requires supervision. The same problem that I mentioned about other people's money that requires the SEC to be vigilant in its enforcement requires us to play in that arena as well.
We have time for one more question. Go ahead.
I'm sure that many of us would like to know more about Mr. Paulson's meeting yesterday you talked about. Can you, number one, define the meeting and what you thought it meant and what came of it? And number two, maybe speculate or comment on what actions may come about now that the meeting's been held.
Well, the title of the program was a Conference on the Competitiveness of America's Capital Markets, and so that was the general theme. and it looked at areas that the Treasury was particularly interested in focusing on, including the regulatory environment, whether we have the right regulatory structure for the 21st century, on the litigation environment, the subject that was just raised, and on the cost of regulation and the benefit that's received from it in a global context. I would say that what one should expect to come of this is, if nothing else, greater coordination among the different financial regulators and departments of the U.S. government. The Treasury Secretary hosted this in part because he is the chairman of something called the President's Working Group on Financial Markets. There are 4 members of that group: the Treasury Secretary, the Fed Chairman, myself, and the Chairman of the CFTC. It was established during the Clinton administration after the 1987 market crash that I referenced earlier. If it has any basic function, it's to share information in a time of crisis. But we've been using it for much more. Recently, we issued a statement of principles on hedge funds that are going to inform our execution as regulators of our separate responsibilities. I think having a common approach in the U.S. government, particularly with our relatively balkanized system of financial regulation compared to other countries where there might be a single regulator for all financial services, is very important. So I think you can expect to see some coordination of approach between the financial regulators as we address these issues. It's very difficult for something to happen in one corner of the capital markets now, whether I regulated the SEC or not, that doesn't affect the capital markets that I am responsible for. But
I think there's clearly a lot of high hopes coming out of those discussions yesterday, and I guess let me try to close this with one question to you, which is, you've got a number of business leaders, other professional service providers in the room today that obviously are very concerned about the capital markets at large, be it from regulation, litigation, global competitiveness, whatever it may be. What advice do you have for the audience tonight in terms of what they can be doing to help shape the agenda and ultimately take some action around that agenda?
Well, the first thing I'd do is, if you're a lawyer, encourage your clients to start filing with the SEC using XBRL and interactive data. If you're an issuer, just jump into it and do it. The reason is it's going to save a lot of money. And it's going to be good for your internal controls and for your internal management. You're going to learn a lot more about your own operations from the data the federal government's making you put together anyway. And your filing with the SEC is going to get cheaper. Second, your investors are really going to like it because they'll get more information out of that same information. Most places I go, I make a pitch for that. And the reason I think it's worthwhile to begin paying attention to now is that there's no question where we're headed. We're going to get there very, very soon, and the sooner we all get started on this, the faster and easier it's going to be. In terms of cost, by the way, for data tagging, United Technologies, I think they are the
UTC, yes.
I'm just trying to think of whether they're the 6th largest industrial company in America or where they rank, but they're obviously one of the biggest companies in the United States. They are one of the early adopters, and for this enormous company to switch to interactive data with their filings cost them $40,000. $40,000. And that was because they spent $30,000 they really didn't have to on a consultant. PepsiCo, if I'm not mistaken, said they did this for $5,000. These are trivial amounts for rather large companies, and the savings would be immediate and not have to wait for 6 months or a year were it not for the fact that currently the SEC is conducting this as a voluntary program so that you still have to file it the old way as well. But I don't think there's any question that this sort of thing that more than pays for itself and has vast benefits. The second thing that I think that we can do is remember that the Sarbanes-Oxley Act we were talking about and a lot of the enforcement actions that we haven't been talking about that are in the back of everybody's minds of the last few years came about for a reason. They came about because of what we lived through with Enron and WorldCom and so on. And remember that the remedy that we think we've put in place includes fixing the tone at the top. So if you run an organization, keep that focus. That shouldn't be just for the years after the horrible things happen. That should be always and everywhere. And I think you all know, if you run an organization, how much your example matters for the people who work for you. So that's what, more than anything, we can do. Our Director of Enforcement gave a speech recently that I thought was remarkable for its simplicity and yet its fundamental truth. What she said is that if you don't want to have more enforcement, then don't break the law. And keeping it simple and trying to exercise some common sense really goes a long way. At least while I'm chairman, we're not going to come after people who are exercising good faith, sound judgment. We're going to come after the people who you want us to come after, who deserve it, who are a threat to investors in the market and to the integrity of the whole enterprise.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think that's great. Before we wrap up, I do want to thank the FPA as well as the NAD for the sponsorship of this evening, and most importantly, thank you all for the support. So again, have a great evening and thanks very much.